Hello and welcome to Focus 54, your real guide to African news. My name is Jeffrey Murimbechi. I know by now you might be wondering, how am I able to wear a suit when it's so scorching hot and we're expecting the rains? And how is it raining in some parts of Africa that never received that much rainfall? I'm talking about the Sahara Desert, which is experiencing some form of flooding. There was snow in parts of Lesotho and South Africa. And you might be wondering, what time is it to farm? And why is it that I'm not sure what the weather is supposed to be like? Why did we not enjoy the blooming purple jacarandas in October, and as we're approaching November? Why did they dry up so fast? This is my simplified version of how climate change is affecting us. And if you're a farmer, you must be very worried right now about how much your insurance on your crop will be. And if you're within the agro sector or in the FMG sector, you'll also be worried if you're going to make any profits or if you're going to lose your business. Well, these and more stories are all about climate change, and Africa is the most vulnerable in terms of the impacts of climate change, facing prolonged droughts, unprecedented rain patterns, rising temperatures, increased occurrences of natural disasters. And we've already seen that hurricanes and tornadoes have already wreaked havoc in some parts of the world, such as the United States. These environmental shifts are already threatening the continent's food security, water resources, economic stability, and placing immense pressure on communities, especially those that are vulnerable and prone to conflicts. Now, in response to these growing threats, African nations urgently calling for innovations and innovative and sustainable solutions to combat change and adapt to these effects. And you have seen that as Zimbabweans, we've also adopted the use of boreholes. We also hear that South Africans are doing the same. But for how long shall we base on vulnerable water tables if the skies are not behaving? And one of the concepts that holds the transformative potential for the continent is green buildings. We'll be talking about that and the adaptation of green building practices across the African countries. And how they can significantly contribute to global efforts of mitigating climate change. But don't take it from me alone. I barely know anything about green building. The first time we discussed with our production crew, when they talked about green buildings, I thought they were talking about a color. But we also discovered that it's way more than that, and it's a much more profound topic. And we've got an expert in studio who will be joining us in the second and third edition of Focus 54, and I'm talking about Dr. Eric Juru, who is the chairman of a Green Building Council in Zimbabwe, and he'll let you know how you can enjoy and have a more sustainable, economic and ecologically friendly way of living. But we'll be joining him in the second edition. Let's start by having a look at the top stories within Zimbabwe and around Africa. And the first one is about the cholera vaccine plant. Two nations, China and Zambia, have poised to jointly construct Africa's first cholera vaccine plant, and the development of the infrastructure will benefit the rest of Africa. So it will start off in Zambia and probably the rest of the continent. We turn to Sudan, where South Sudan is banking on oil reserves to fill budget gaps within the country's finances as it tries to reinvest itself to compete economically in the continent. And speaking of the continent, we all know about BRICS nations, and there is a lot of speculation about BRICS nations, and online credible sources, including the NASDAQ, published that there is a potential that BRIC nations are interested in creating a new currency to compete with the US dollar, and recently announced plans for blockchain payment systems that will challenge the status quo and probably disrupt the SWIFT systems and all other global banking systems. And these nations are very powerful and will allow certain things such as illegal imposed sanctions and economic embargoes to be lifted. And I'm talking about Brazil, Russia, India, China, as well as South Africa, the major powers in the world. Lastly, we look at news in Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe's Green Commitment Pledge has been signed with emphasis on the need for a unified approach in tackling the country's pressing environmental challenges. And we'll be talking to Dr. Juru about all of these. So do stay tuned for the second edition of Focus 54. Welcome to the second edition of Focus 54. We are focusing on the issue of climate change and how to mitigate how the brains of 54 countries within the continent are working towards us mitigating and defeating the challenges that we face as a continent. Now, I am joined in studio by Dr. Eric Juru, who is the chairman of a Green Building Council in Zimbabwe. Dr. Juru, good morning and good day, and welcome to Focus 54.
Greetings, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure having you around.
I know we might have to explain to people how we are able to wear suits when it's so hot, but thankfully our studio environment protects us. But the rest of Africa is not spared from these kind of situations where it's scorchingly hot and the weather has changed. Can you explain to us the concept of green buildings and in context of climate change and economic environmental sustainability?
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Green buildings are definitely not buildings that are painted green, first and foremost.
Okay.
Most importantly. They are buildings that, by design and construction and operation, are designed to conserve energy. The bulk of our energy comes from fossil fuel, which the emissions will then enhance carbon emissions. Globally, at global level, buildings are known to contribute 40% of carbon emissions. That's a huge contribution that us dealing with buildings will have addressed the 40% of the carbon emissions that are out there in the environment. We all know the impacts of climate change on our daily lives, the flooding that happens in the low veld. Do you remember a couple of years ago, Cyclone Idai, the droughts that we're experiencing? We're now having to run around to import the food, and all those are impacts of climate change. And buildings, they have their own way of contributing. And in us focusing on green buildings, we're trying to address the climate change impacts onto the environment, to have buildings that are energy efficient, resource efficient, and that are sustainable.
Now, you've spoken at a macro level, where we've got, I would say, the broader concept of green buildings. Now, let's talk to two people. One, those that are part of the Zimbabwe's construction boom and Africa's construction boom. Recently, we noticed, actually physically witnessed, I would say, an insane level of construction within Uganda, as well as Ethiopia and Zimbabwe. Let's talk to those that are into commercial properties, and then let's talk to those that are in residential properties and rural properties. When we talk about green buildings, what are the changes that we've seen that can reduce the carbon footprint? Kumusha, we grew up, and the source of fuel traditionally was firewood, but there's now gas stoves and things like that. What are some of the measures that are being implemented and that you recommend that we should implement to have greener buildings?
As I've mentioned, that greener buildings are buildings that are designed and constructed and operated in such a way that they conserve the energy, they preserve the environment. So we're looking at the materials, which is the first breaking point in the materials that are being used in construction. We all know that we use clay bricks, which we have to go out there and dig those ant hills, and in the process we are destroying the environment. You look at when we have the roofs, those are trees that we have to cut down for us to have the roof trusses. And if you look at the tiles, that's concrete that has to be bent again. You look the emissions that go with it. So in us revising the materials that we use in buildings, That's the first step that we need. We'll be protecting the environment in the process. And then you take the next step further, is that how are buildings operated and managed? These are specifically the commercial properties. Because buildings, they also consume more than 40% of the energy that is produced. It's consumed in buildings. So if in buildings we have to be lessening the issue of the air conditioning, you have buildings that are naturally designed to cater for free flow of air, the north-south facing buildings that will allow as much radiation to come in so that they warm the buildings rather than us using electricity to warm the buildings.
So when you look at buildings such as Eastgate Shopping Mall, which is in Harare, I understand that that building, the architects were inspired by anthills such that it naturally cools. Is this what reduces carbon footprints? Certain houses nowadays have what they call natural lighting within factories and the use of solar instead of electricity. How much of an impact does that have on the national grid, on the energy sector and the environment?
I would want to draw your attention to the recent announced energy efficient policy by ZERA, that if it is implemented fully, we are bound to create actually a new power plant from just saving the energy. So much energy is wasted in the way because buildings are wrongly built, or because we need so much energy to heat up the buildings or to cool down the buildings. So by design, if you allow natural elements to heat or cool the building, it means that you are saving on the energy. Energy is the most crucial aspect of that contributes to climate change, in the sense that I said that our energy is produced from fossil fuel. That then goes to say that a green building can also have solar or use other alternatives like the biogas or the wind, wind power to generate power. So it's about energy that goes into the building that is then expended in the buildings.
Dr. Juru, earlier on you said that when you're talking about green buildings, the first thing is the value chain of the materials that make up the building. You talked about sustainable and new innovative things such as recycled bricks and things like that. The big question is it affordable now for our markets in Africa, in Zimbabwe and countries like us?
I can say simply that it's affordable. We are used to the traditional way of doing things. Look at the bulk of our buildings. They're actually over-designed, they're over-specced. And if we have to revisit that, we reduce the material that we use, our buildings will still be strong, climate resilient, and be saving the environment. We definitely need much less brick. You had drawn the attention to the aspect of light. You look at a building that has more...
People are switching on lights during the day.
Exactly, but if you have bigger windows, you are saving on the bricks. And you have more light coming in, you don't need to switch on the power. And the same way that if you now need to put in less bricks, it means less water that you are using to be plastering, to be building that. So in a way, a green building will always save energy, and there are long-term benefits that come with it. I'll give you an example for solar. Solar is said to have a payback period of around 5-6 years.
And some actually argue that even earlier than that.
Even earlier than that. Now, panels are now going for 25 years. You have a guarantee for 25 years on your panels. Batteries are now coming up with a lifespan of 10 years. So there is a long-term benefit. We think in the short term that, no, if I have to put in solar, that's a capital expenditure that if I can get ZESA on. But at what impact to the environment? By us trying to use the conventional energy, it means that we are simply impacting more to the environment. Next thing, we have our droughts. We don't have water. We have to be importing food for us to survive on. It costs the nation more for us not to have green buildings.
Now, when you spoke about food, you made me a bit hungry there, Doc. And one of the things that the president of Zimbabwe and speaking on the back of the SADC summit, food security and the effects of the El Nino effect were topical. In terms of green buildings, are there any, I would say, rudimental changes that farmers can make to make sure that they can be more drought resilient and using green building solutions such as the ones you're talking about?
No, ultimately, the bulk of our daily lives, they happen in buildings. Farmers, they need buildings, they need houses to stay in. Farmers, they need to put up their warehouses. They need to put up their silos, which is all to do with construction. So the role that you have to play is to focus on resource efficiency. So the construction of the tobacco bans has to be resource efficient. We have to use the net is zero rated bricks is in to use as little energy as we possibly can. So that way they contribute, because ultimately the farmers are the biggest losers when it comes to the droughts. And yet they contribute to the droughts through practices that are not sustainable.
Now, thank you so much, Doc. What we're going to do is we're going to take a short break and come back for the second edition of for the third and final segment of Focus 54. In this one, we will ask the good doctor about government policies, about government plans, urban planning, and things that affect you and I. If our leaders and leaders in Africa are open to the idea of green building and where we will be within the next few years. Stay tuned to Focus 54. The third and final segment will be coming right after this. Welcome back to the third and final segment of Focus 54, and we are still joined by our expert, Dr. Juru, who is from the Green Building Council in Zimbabwe, and we're about to talk about the very difficult bits, Doc. Let's start off with our government in Zimbabwe and from the policies that are also being implemented by governments within the continent. Our governments and our leaders within Africa, starting with our leaders, are they open to the idea of green buildings becoming the norm and the standard right now? And if they are or are not, what are the challenges and setbacks that are delaying the slow rollout of these solutions?
Oh, interesting question then. Indeed, the government, firstly, the government from a constitutional point of view, Section 74 of our Constitution, it outlines that it outlines environmental rights. Wherever there are rights, there are obligations. So it obligates the government to take initiatives to address the issues that you have raised. Further to that, within the Constitution, it said the government will have to set up the laws. And I'm glad to share with you that we have the Environmental Management Act, which is our first and most important law that has to deal with the aspects of environmental preservation. And then beyond that, you have other statutes. You have ZERA, which has just come up with energy efficiency. You also have the national housing that has come up with the national housing, the housing policy. So, in terms of the laws, yes, they are there, and it's work in progress. We need more, but the one that specifically deals with green buildings is not yet there. It is on record that Minister of National Housing, together with Minister of Local Government and also Minister of Environment, they are working with United Nations CTCN to come up with building codes that will then be used as the standard for green buildings, because they actually appreciate the need for us to have green buildings in the country. So it's work in progress. It is happening. The government is open to it. And finally, when we have the approved building codes, green codes, then it means that we have something that is on paper that is related to Zimbabwe, that we have our own definition of a green building.
Doc, when you're talking about the color codes and building and national building, according to the Second Republic, speaking, about what's going on in the country, in attainment of Vision 2030, one of the things is having an upper middle income status. We're already seeing the rise of cluster homes and gentrification within urban city planning. Are these new buildings and these new lush apartments that are coming up, are they somehow, some way adopting green revolution and green building solutions from your observation?
The observation is that it's work in progress. You realize that the need for us to have power is resulted in people having solar.
Okay.
So that on its own. The need for people to realize some revenue is resulted in people separating their waste so that they're able to sell the plastics and what have you, which is also another contributor towards climate change. You will note that from research done by the UN Habitat, They say that come year 2050, 75% of buildings that will be there are not yet built. So much as we are excited about so many buildings that are there today, that are being constructed today, but it's nothing else to compare to what is going to be built in the coming years. So as we progress and we have the statutes in place, it will summarize that to say that yes, with the availability of the codes and what have you, then we'll actually have more buildings that are actually green.
There's a Northwestern school that I'm actually forgetting the name that has an architect. It should be in Mali, where you have an architect who was inspired by ants once again, and they used sustainable bricks made from the sand that was around them. It's got natural lighting and cooling and heating properties. This is one of the countries. From your research outside Zimbabwe, what are other African countries and African leaders talking about? And is this conversation about green buildings isolated to Zimbabwe only, or it's now a regional conversation that can be put in front of policymakers when our nations and leaders on all 54 countries meet?
At global level, that's why we have the COP conferences. We have last year we had COP20, COP28, and this year we'll have again COP29. So at global level, the activities that are happening. And then within our field, specific field on green buildings, we have the World Green Building Council. And then at national level, the respective Green Building Council in Zimbabwe actually chair the Green Building Council of Zimbabwe. South Africa is there. Zambia, we have Kenya. Let me mention the ones that the concept is so pronounced. Nigeria, Ghana, Egypt, it's all there. And when they go to COP, all of them, they are representing themselves, they are representing the issues on how they are playing their part in preserving the environment through buildings. So this is a global discussion. Africa, there is what is called the Africa Network, which again, Green Building Council of Zimbabwe is a member of, where we discuss at African level on initiatives that we are taking or making. We are currently working with Nigeria. That's where that's where it has been initiated, to see how the nationally determined contributions can be addressed through buildings. So it's a project that we are also participating in as Zimbabwe. We were making our contributions and taking learning notes so that we'll apply the same to Zimbabwe. So it's work in progress, it's happening, it is trending, and there is urgent need for the built environment to start taking care of the environment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Juru, for joining us. I think you've summed up, I'll say, a tip of the iceberg of something that is more profound and much greater. And I do implore onto you to visit and go online and look for the Green Building Council of Zimbabwe, and also look up Dr. Eric Juru, who is one of the champions that is leading the continent and not only Zimbabwe in this fight against climate change. His group and many others who are fighting for the continent are also talking to governments, talking to leaders, talking to those in comments to make sure that we have an absolute green revolution. Unfortunately, time has not been the best on our side, and we can follow this conversation much later as we end the year. But for Focus 54, catch us on the next episode. My name is Jeffrey Murimbechi.